The music fades and soft, almost hesitant, as if it knows something terrible is about to surface. And then the scene opens, not with wealth or glamour, but with a trembling breath. He didn't hear the whisper at first, just the clatter of plates, the low hum of conversations, and the uneven tapping of his son's cane against the polished floor. But there was something else in the room that night, something colder than the air conditioning, sharper than the silverware. It slithered beneath the surface, quiet yet powerful, the kind of presence that makes the skin tighten before the mind understands why. People turned, not to admire, not to welcome, but to assess, to classify. Their eyes drifted from the billionaire father, dressed in tailored confidence, to the young woman approaching his table. A waitress with tired shoes and hopeful eyes, unaware that every step she took would unravel a chain of events none of them were prepared for. The father noticed the shift first, the way the room's warmth thinned as she neared, the way whispers took shape around her, soft but cutting. His disabled son, however, didn't sense the tension. He only saw kindness. A hand offered, a gentle nod toward the music, an invitation to move, to feel free, if only for a moment. But freedom has a price in places where prejudice still lingers. And in that split second, before a single dance step is taken, something begins to crack. Because what happens next doesn't just change a moment. It changes a life. The only question is, whose? Life for Alexander Ward had long settled into a rhythm he could trust, one built not on the weight of his fortune, but on the fragile routines that anchored his son's world. Each morning began the same way, soft sunlight filtering through glass walls, the distant buzz of the estate staff starting their day, and the steady, deliberate breaths of his boy as he prepared himself to move through a world that wasn't built with him in mind. Alexander never missed those moments. They grounded him more than any board meeting ever could. Despite the empire he had built, one stitched together through late nights, impossible decisions, and the cold precision the business world demanded, his home life was a gentler universe. A space where his son's quiet victories mattered more than quarterly gains, where progress was measured in steps taken without fear, not in rising stocks. Their mornings were filled with small rituals. Oatmeal with too much honey, classical music humming low from hidden speakers, and Alexander's voice offering patient encouragement as his son practiced shifting his weight, learning the rhythm his legs sometimes refused to recognize. But beyond the safety of those walls, a different rhythm pulsed. One Alexander didn't always know how to navigate. People saw his wealth before they saw his humanity. They saw his son's disability before they saw his light. And though Alexander tried to ignore the tension that sometimes followed them, tight smiles, whispered assumptions, the subtle tilt of a head evaluating what didn't need evaluation, he felt its presence like a faint tremor under polished floors. He told himself the world was changing, that kindness outnumbered cruelty, that his son wouldn't inherit the shadows he'd learned to walk around. Most days he believed it. Yet recently, there were signs he couldn't quite shake. The way a family at the park suddenly gathered their children when his son tried to join a simple game. The restaurant host who spoke to the boy in an overly slow voice as if understanding were tied to mobility. Or the neighbor whose compliments about Alexander's strength carried an uncomfortable weight. None of it erupted into open conflict, but each moment chipped at something he didn't want to name. Still, life moved forward. Alexander planned surprise weekend outings. He scheduled a rare evening out, just the two of them, at a warm, bustling restaurant he'd heard wonderful things about. A simple treat, a break in routine, a chance for his son to feel the joy of music and motion in a place that welcomed families. At least, that's what he hoped. Because as the day unfolded, subtle tremors in the air hinted at something shifting. A tension he couldn't yet see but would soon feel. And by the time he stepped through the restaurant doors that evening, he had no idea that the fragile piece he protected so fiercely was already beginning to unravel, thread by invisible thread. The restaurant greeted them with warm lighting and the comforting aroma of butter and herbs, the kind that usually softened Alexander's shoulders and eased his son's nerves. For a moment, it felt like the peaceful evening he'd envisioned. Tables glowing under amber lamps, soft jazz lilting through the air, and a gentle clatter of dishes that blended into the hum of contented guests. His son's face brightened, the kind of smile that made every challenge they'd overcome feel worthwhile. But even the warmest spaces can carry cold edges. The first shift was barely noticeable. A sudden pause in conversation at the nearest table. The faint scrape of a fork against porcelain as someone's hand hesitated mid-air. Alexander sensed it before he fully registered it. A subtle tightening of the space around them, as if the air had pulled back. The hostess guided them through the dining room. Her steps remained steady, but her posture changed, shoulders stiffening, pace accelerating. She led them toward a small corner table near the back wall. A table close to the kitchen door, where servers rushed past with steaming plates, where noise built in erratic bursts, where guests usually sat only when the restaurant was full. But the restaurant wasn't full. Most of the central tables, a wide open space with a clear view of the stage where live music played, remained empty. Bright, inviting, unclaimed. The corner felt dimmer, smaller, like a place meant not for guests to enjoy, but for guests to be hidden. Still, Alexander didn't protest. His son was already beginning to settle into the chair with cautious excitement, eyes darting toward the musicians tuning their instruments. Music always softened the world for him. So Alexander swallowed the unease and told himself it didn't matter. It was just a seat, just a coincidence, just another tiny moment he could choose not to analyze. But the world had a way of making itself clear, even when he tried to give it grace. Minutes later, the waitress approached, her steps uncertain, but her smile genuine in a way that eased some of the tension gripping the father's chest. She carried an aura of quiet resilience, one earned from long shifts and harder days. Her hands trembled slightly as she balanced the notepad against the tray, but her eyes softened when they landed on his son, not with pity, but with warmth. And Alexander noticed. He noticed the contrast between her kindness and the glances that flickered around the room. He noticed the table of diners who shifted in their seats as she walked past. He noticed the way their eyes narrowed at her, not at him. Before she even reached the table, he could feel judgment gathering around her like smoke. His son felt none of it. His world was filled with rhythm, not prejudice. But Alexander felt the first real tremor. As the evening unfolded, the tremor deepened. The waitress stopped by often, checking on them with a sincerity that never wavered. She treated his son with a natural ease, as though the boy's cane and careful movements were simply part of who he was, not a limitation, not an inconvenience. Each small gesture chipped away at the tension around their table, and for brief stretches of time, Alexander allowed his shoulders to lower. But others didn't. A couple at a nearby booth angled their bodies subtly away whenever the waitress approached. Their postures stiffened, their expressions hardened. They whispered behind their hands, eyes darting between the waitress and Alexander's table, as if trying to decode a story they'd already decided the ending to. Minutes passed, and the room seemed to rearrange itself around unspoken judgments. Conversations resumed but took on a sharper edge. A few guests cast curious glances toward Alexander's son, not malicious, but invasive enough to make Alexander tighten his hand around his water glass. The second disruption came more bluntly. A server carrying a tray stepped too quickly behind the waitress, bumping her arm just enough to make the tray tilt. A glass wobbled, catching the light before clattering onto the floor. The sound cracked through the dining room like a sudden storm. The server muttered something under his breath, not loud, but loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, brows lifting, whispers sharpening again. The waitress apologized, though it hadn't been her fault. Her cheeks flushed with heat, but she continued working with the same quiet dignity, refusing to let embarrassment swallow her professionalism. Alexander watched the incident with tightening concern. Something was off. Something deeper than small-town rudeness. Something systematic and familiar in ways he didn't want to revisit. His son, oblivious to the tension, perked up when the music shifted into a brighter, lively tune. A soft, rhythmic beat that carried a pulse he could feel even from his seat. His fingers tapped against the table's edge. His eyes followed the movement of the waitress as she passed again, and she noticed his interest. She paused, hesitated, then gently extended a hand, an unspoken invitation not just to move, but to belong. Alexander's breath caught. His son's joy flickered bright and immediate, a spark that traveled through every fiber of his being. He began to rise, cautious but determined. But as he did, the tension in the room escalated. A man at the table near the stage stiffened dramatically, his jaw clenching. A woman beside him leaned closer, murmuring something that made the man's expression darken. Another group farther across the room glanced toward the scene, eyes narrowing with the kind of judgment Alexander recognized all too well, a judgment reserved for those they deemed out of place. The waitress ignored the stares. She offered her hand more firmly, reassurance shining through the noise. This, Alexander realized, was the moment everything would tip. His son placed his hand in hers, steadying himself. The boy's movements were slow, deliberate, each shift in balance a small victory. The waitress guided him gently toward a small open space near their table. Not the main dance area, just enough room to sway, to feel the beat, to experience a sliver of freedom. But the room did not soften. A pair of guests exchanged looks heavy with disdain. A server paused mid-stride, eyes fixated on the scene. The man near the stage shifted in his seat again, irritation building. The music played on, light, joyful, unaware of the tightening atmosphere. Alexander rose halfway from his chair, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. His heart battled between pride for his son and fear of the world's hostility. His palms were damp, knuckles pale from gripping the edge of the table. Then the next blow struck. A low murmur began near the bar. It rippled outward, passing from table to table like a rumor carried on a current of prejudice. Words floated through the air, soft, sharp, unmistakable. The kind that turned rooms cold. The kind that burned even when left unspoken. Alexander couldn't hear every word, but he didn't need to. The tone was enough. The shift in posture. The tightening of expressions. The sense that something sacred was being trespassed, simply because kindness crossed an invisible line the room had quietly drawn. The waitress seemed to feel it, too. Her movement faltered for a fraction of a second. Her smile wavered, not from uncertainty about the dance, but from fear of what might come next. But she steadied herself, grounding her emotions in the way she held Alexander's son with gentle assurance. For a brief moment, the room's ugliness clashed violently with the purity of the dance. The boy swayed carefully, leaning into the music, his body learning the rhythm one beat at a time. His face radiated joy, simple, unfiltered, iridescent joy. The kind that made adults forget their burdens. The kind that reminded Alexander of everything worth fighting for. But then, a chair scraped harshly across the floor. The sound shot through the air like a warning. The man near the stage stood abruptly, his posture rigid, his expression hardening into something ugly and undeniable. His movements were too sharp, too tense. Others noticed. Conversation stalled. The air thickened. Alexander's pulse kicked into overdrive, pounding behind his ribs like an alarm. He wasn't sure yet what the man intended, whether it would be words, actions, or simply another layer of hostility, but the danger was suddenly real. The waitress felt it, too. Her hand tightened around the boy's, steadying him, shielding him. Everything teetered on a fragile edge. Alexander took a step forward, ready to intervene, ready to protect the moment his son had waited all evening for. But just as he reached them, the restaurant manager appeared from the kitchen corridor, eyes sharp, lips pressed thin, posture stiff with purpose. And the room held its breath. Because this wasn't just about a dance anymore. Something larger was unraveling, one thread at a time. Threads woven from judgment, discomfort, prejudice, and the unspoken rules that dictated who was welcome, who was tolerated, and who was quietly pushed to the margins. The next words, the next gesture, the next decision would push the night toward its breaking point. And Alexander sensed, deep in his gut, that what was coming would not simply test his patience. It would test his faith in the world. And it would force him to confront a truth he'd been trying to outrun his entire life. The room stood on the precipice. And the fall was coming. The manager's approach carried the weight of something predetermined, an outcome shaped long before this moment, sharpened by the tensions simmering since the father and son walked through the door. His steps were crisp, almost rehearsed, his expression carved into a rigid mask of authority that swallowed any chance of empathy. The restaurant's warmth collapsed around him. Conversations thinned to whispers, then to silence. Even the music faltered, as though the musicians sensed something dark swelling through the air. The lights above flickered faintly, their glow dimming just enough to cast deeper shadows across the room. Alexander felt the shift like a punch to the ribs. The manager stopped inches from the boy, from the waitress, still holding his hand, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her fear. The boy's posture wavered, the joy that had animated him drained by the tension radiating outward in suffocating waves. Guests leaned forward, drawn not by compassion, but by anticipation, the kind born from years of witnessing conflict from a safe distance, never from the center of the storm. The manager's presence was a wall, and his judgment came without a single word spoken. He extended an arm, not toward Alexander, but toward the waitress. His eyes locked onto her with chilling coldness, and in an instant, the balance of the room snapped. There was no compassion, no curiosity, no attempt to understand what she had offered. A moment of dignity to a boy who rarely felt brave in public spaces. Instead, there was accusation, condemnation, a verdict delivered silently, but with devastating weight. The manager reached for her elbow, not gently, not professionally, but with the kind of grip that made the tables nearby stiffen, breaths catching like trapped birds. Her body jerked slightly, instinctively recoiling. The boy stumbled at the sudden absence of her support. His cane skittered against the floor, the hollow clack piercing the air as his balance tipped sharply backward. For a fraction of a second, everything moved too slowly. The father lunged forward. The boy's arms flailed. The room gasped. The waitress reached back toward him, desperate to steady him. But the manager's grip tightened, pulling her away before she could help. The boy's body twisted in midair, his weight collapsing under him as gravity yanked him toward the unforgiving tile. Alexander caught him just before his head struck the floor. The force of the catch rattled his own bones, pain shooting up his arms, but he held his son tightly, cradling him against his chest like something fragile the world had tried to shatter. A stunned silence filled the restaurant. Then came the murmurs, not of concern, not an apology, but of blame. Blame directed at the waitress. Blame directed at Alexander. Blame directed at a moment of joy that had offended the unspoken rules of the space. The manager stepped back, straightening his shirt as though the violence of the moment were a trivial inconvenience. His gaze swept the room, gathering silent approval from a few too eager faces. Validation, permission. Then he spoke, not in words directed at the father, but in a tone meant for the audience around them, as if delivering a performance more than an explanation. His voice cut through the air, thick with accusation, framing the boy's stumble as disruption, the dance as unsafe, the waitress's kindness as inappropriate behavior. Each phrase hammered against Alexander's ribs like a blow. The waitress stood frozen, her breath sharp and uneven. Shame flushed across her face, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because the room had decided she had. The quiet dignity she carried all evening trembled under the weight of so many watching eyes. But this time, Alexander didn't swallow the moment. He stood, his son held protectively against him, and met the manager's gaze with a stare that radiated pure, controlled fury. A heat he'd spent years keeping buried flared inside him. Years of overlooking microaggressions. Years of choosing peace over the exhausting battle of confronting every cruelty. The room braced for an explosion. Alexander's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. His silence alone felt like thunder building behind the clouds. Still, the manager stepped closer, doubling down. His words sharpened, shifting from veiled implications to outright falsehoods, crafting a narrative that twisted the truth until kindness became misconduct and joy became disruption. The final blow came when he gestured toward the exit, not at the waitress, but at Alexander and his son. A dismissal, a removal, a declaration that their presence, and hers, violated some unspoken order the restaurant believed it had the right to protect. A few guests nodded, complicit. A few looked away, uncomfortable but unmoving. Only one person trembled with visible outrage. The waitress, still rooted to the spot, still processing the violence wrapped in authority unfolding before her eyes. Alexander's son tightened his grip around his father's shirt, small fingers trembling, breath uneven as fear seeped into his bones. His joy had collapsed into confusion, his courage shattered into pieces on the restaurant floor. That was the moment something inside Alexander broke. Not the kind of break that destroys, the kind that transforms. He shifted the boy in his arms, grounding him, then turned his gaze back toward the manager with an expression that made even the room's loudest critics fall silent. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just about a dance. This wasn't just about a table. This wasn't even about one night. It was about the thousands of invisible lines drawn by people who believed they could dictate who belonged where, whose joy was acceptable, whose humanity was conditional. The father exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment burning through him like wildfire. Behind him, the musicians had stopped playing entirely. Servers froze mid-step. The air pulsed with something electric, dangerous, undeniable. And in that suspended moment, between action and consequence, between silence and eruption, Alexander realized he was standing in the very place where two futures diverged. One in which he carried his son out quietly, as he'd done 1,000 times when the world turned cruel, and one in which he finally refused to bow. The choice hung between breaths. The entire restaurant waited, and the walls around him, public judgment, unspoken expectations, quiet prejudice, began to crack. Because what happened next would define everything. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across lifetimes. For a breath, the entire restaurant hovered in a suspended universe, one where fear, anger, and truth collided so forcefully that no one could pretend anymore. And then, without raising his voice, without breaking his composure, Alexander turned toward the waitress and offered the smallest, most deliberate nod. A nod that said, "You are not alone. Not tonight." He shifted his son carefully into a steadier embrace and stepped forward into the center of the room, taking with him the weight of every injustice that had been sharpened against them. The air tightened, expectation, discomfort, anxiety, all rising like a tide. Eyes darted away. Some turned rigid, unwilling to confront what they were complicit in. Others softened, guilt inching into their expressions, as the truth revealed itself in painful clarity. The manager began to speak again, but whatever authority he tried to command collapsed beneath the piercing quiet that followed the father's presence. Alexander didn't need to respond. He didn't need a speech. His son's trembling body, the waitress's shaken dignity, the shattering of a simple night out, all of it told the truth louder than any confrontation ever could. He walked toward the exit with the boy, still held close, each step echoing through the restaurant like a verdict handed down to everyone who believed silence absolved them. The waitress followed a step behind, not seeking protection, but standing in shared defiance of a moment that tried to diminish her humanity. When the door closed behind them, a cold gust swept the room, exposing just how hollow the restaurant's warmth had been all along. Outside, the night air pressed against Alexander's lungs, sharp and sobering. His son clung to him, shaking softly, not from a fall, but from the crushing realization that joy, so rare, so hard-won, had been stolen again. Alexander held him tighter, whispering steady breaths into his ear, grounding him in a world that felt suddenly too vast and too cruel. In the days that followed, the story refused to stay buried. Witnesses spoke. Some who had stayed silent in the moment found courage in hindsight. A cell phone video surfaced, capturing just enough of the confrontation to ignite conversations far beyond that single night. The clip spread from neighbor to neighbor, community to community, each viewer witnessing not just a mistreated father or humiliated waitress, but a reflection of the patterns so many lived through in different forms every day. The waitress came forward not for attention, but to protect the boy whose only crime had been happiness. Her courage emboldened others, former employees, past diners, members of the community who had experienced similar treatment. Their testimonies traced a pattern long ignored, a mosaic of small wounds that, when seen together, revealed a deeply rooted problem the restaurant could no longer deny. The manager was removed from his position. But anyone who understood systemic injustice knew that individual consequences were never the full story. The roots ran deeper, woven through policies, expectations, whispered biases, unspoken hierarchies about who belonged where, who deserved grace, and who was seen as an inconvenience within their own joy. Alexander didn't seek lawsuits or retaliation. What he wanted, more than anything, was accountability, not measured in punishments, but in change. He met with the restaurant's owners, with community leaders, with advocacy groups who worked daily to dismantle the invisible lines that shape public spaces. And in those conversations he found something rare, a willingness to see discomfort not as a threat, but as a call to rebuild. For the waitress, the incident reshaped her life in ways she never expected. Community members rallied behind her, celebrating her dignity, her compassion, the courage she showed when others tried to silence her. Scholarships, job offers, pathways she once believed were closed began to open. Yet even as doors appeared, she carried the night's imprint, the fear, the shame, the trembling moment when a single act of kindness nearly cost her everything. Alexander's son changed, too. For weeks, he struggled to step into public spaces without gripping his father's hand a little tighter. His confidence fractured, then slowly rebuilt, piece by piece, as Alexander guided him gently back into the world. Music became healing again. Movement became freedom again. But the memory lingered, a reminder that safety for him would never be guaranteed by wealth, status, or good intentions alone. And the community? The ripple spread further than anyone expected. People began to question their own assumptions about who was welcome, whose joy was acceptable, whose presence disrupted the fragile comfort of public spaces. Conversations sparked in living rooms, schools, workplaces. Not the polite surface-level kind, but the raw, uncomfortable kind that forces reflection. Because the truth was undeniable. This incident wasn't an isolated break in the system. It was the system. A system built on centuries of exclusion, reinforced by generations of subtle gestures, microaggressions, and quiet compliance. A system in which discrimination often hides in plain sight, masked as policy, professionalism, or protecting the atmosphere. The restaurant became a symbol, not a shame, but of reckoning. A reminder that racism doesn't always come in shouts or slurs. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in seating placements, in who gets believed, in who gets blamed, in who gets removed from the table simply for existing with joy. For Alexander, the greatest shift happened within himself. He realized that his silence, his attempts to shield his son by absorbing every small injustice and walking away, was no longer protection. It was participation in a system that relied on polite endurance to survive. He vowed to speak now, not out of anger, but out of responsibility. And so he did, publicly, calmly, powerfully. His voice carried farther than he expected, not because of wealth, but because it echoed the lived experiences of countless families whose stories had never been heard. The world didn't change overnight, but something cracked open, and through that crack, truth poured in. Because, at the end of all, the question remained: how many everyday injustices go unchallenged simply because they're dressed in politeness? How many lives are shaped by quiet prejudice that never makes headlines? What would our world look like if we chose courage over comfort, even once? This story may end here, but its reality unfolds every day. And the next chapter belongs to all of us.